My name is Margaret Reynolds, and at 67 years old, I never imagined my 40-year marriage to Richard would end with my own son excluding me from my husband's inheritance meeting. This is family, Mom. We'll let you know later, Brandon said, gesturing toward the door. The pain of those words cut deeper than any knife could. What my son didn't realize was that I had the updated will tucked safely in my purse. To him, I was no longer family, but Richard had made sure I would always be protected. Before I continue with my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Take a moment to drop your location in the comments, hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about standing up for yourself when it matters most. Richard and I met during our sophomore year at Northwestern University. I was studying education, planning to become a teacher, while Richard was pursuing a business degree with dreams of starting his own construction company. Our first meeting happened in the campus library, where I accidentally knocked over his carefully arranged stack of business textbooks. Instead of being angry, he laughed and asked me to coffee. That coffee date turned into dinner, which turned into 40 years of marriage. After graduation, Richard started his construction business from nothing but determination and a small loan from his father. Reynolds Construction began in our garage with just Richard, a pickup truck, and a handful of tools. During those early years, we lived on ramen noodles and dreams, but Richard's passion never wavered. When our first child, Brandon, was born in 1985, I made the decision to put my teaching career on hold to support Richard's growing business and raise our family. It wasn't an easy choice, but we agreed it was the best one for our family at the time. Brandon was always Richard's shadow, even as a toddler. He would trail after his father with a plastic hammer, mimicking everything Richard did. As he grew, it became clear that Brandon had inherited Richard's business acumen and determination. By the time he was in high school, Brandon was already working summers at Reynolds Construction, learning the business from the ground up. 2 years after Brandon, our daughter Sophia arrived. Unlike her brother, Sophia was more interested in science than construction. She was compassionate and analytical, eventually pursuing medicine and becoming a successful pediatrician. Sophia always maintained a balanced relationship with both Richard and me, never showing favoritism but always being the peacemaker in family disagreements. Our youngest, Diana, came along 5 years later, completing our family. Diana was the free spirit, artistic and emotional. She pursued a career in graphic design, but struggled to find stable employment. Despite her financial challenges, Diana remained closest to me, often stopping by for dinner or calling just to chat. She and Richard had a more complicated relationship. He loved her dearly but never quite understood her artistic passions or her seeming disinterest in financial stability. As the children grew, so did Reynolds Construction. What started in our garage expanded to become one of the largest commercial construction companies in the Midwest. Richard's dedication and business savvy paid off, and by the time he reached his 50s, we were living comfortably in a beautiful home overlooking Lake Michigan. Brandon graduated from Wharton Business School and immediately joined Reynolds Construction as a project manager. Richard was thrilled to have his son following in his footsteps, and it was understood by everyone that Brandon would eventually take over the company. The two of them would spend hours discussing business strategies, leaving me and the girls to our own devices. When Brandon married Rebecca, a marketing executive from a wealthy family, I tried my best to welcome her into our family. But from the beginning there was tension between us. Rebecca came from old money and never missed an opportunity to subtly remind me of my middle-class background. She would make comments about my fashion choices or redecorating suggestions for my home that left me feeling inadequate and outdated. Brandon, always eager to please his new wife, began siding with Rebecca over me in small disagreements. At first, they were trivial matters, holiday planning or dinner arrangements, but over time the pattern became clear. My son was choosing his wife over his mother, and the distance between us grew. Sophia married a fellow doctor named James, and they gave us 2 beautiful grandchildren, Emily and Nathan. Sophia made a point of bringing the children to visit regularly, ensuring they maintained a close relationship with both Richard and me. Her balanced approach to family life was a stark contrast to Brandon's increasingly business-focused mindset. Diana remained single, bouncing between relationships and jobs. Richard worried about her constantly, afraid she would never find stability. I understood Diana's journey better. She was searching for passion and meaning, not just security. This difference in perspective created another subtle division between Richard and me as our children grew into adults. 2 years ago, Richard's health began to decline. What started as occasional shortness of breath developed into serious heart problems. His first hospitalization scared all of us, particularly me. The thought of losing my partner of nearly 4 decades was terrifying. During his recovery, the family dynamics that had been slowly shifting for years suddenly came into sharp focus. As Reynolds Construction grew from a garage startup to a multi-million-dollar company, my role evolved as well. While I wasn't officially on the payroll, I became Richard's social director, hosting dinner parties for potential clients, organizing company events, and creating the warm family image that helped Richard secure many important contracts. Behind every successful man is a woman who works twice as hard without recognition, and I embraced that role without complaint because I believed in Richard and our shared dream. When Brandon graduated from business school and joined the company, I was initially thrilled. Our son was brilliant, hardworking, and dedicated, all qualities that would serve him well as the future leader of Reynolds Construction. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly he would begin to erase my contributions from the company narrative. At Brandon's first company Christmas party as an executive, he gave a speech thanking his father for building the business from nothing, acknowledging key employees, and even thanking Rebecca for her valuable marketing insights. My name wasn't mentioned once, despite the fact that I had organized that very party and many others before it. When I mentioned this to Richard later that night, he brushed it off as an oversight, but the hurt lingered. As the years passed, Brandon took on more responsibilities at Reynolds Construction. Richard was proud to see his son succeed, but I noticed concerning patterns in Brandon's management style. Where Richard had always valued relationships and treated employees like family, Brandon focused exclusively on the bottom line. Longtime employees began to leave, replaced by younger, less experienced workers who would work for lower wages. Rebecca's influence on Brandon became increasingly apparent. She came from a family where business was cutthroat and family loyalty meant blind support for whatever brought in more money. Under her guidance, Brandon began to view the construction company as his birthright rather than a family legacy to be respected and preserved. Family gatherings became battlegrounds of subtle power plays. Rebecca would arrange seating to separate me from Richard at holiday dinners. Brandon would monopolize conversations with business talk, excluding his sisters and me. When I would try to change the subject to something everyone could participate in, Brandon would give me that look, the one that said I was being irrelevant and bothersome. The rift between us grew wider when Brandon and Rebecca built their new home, a sprawling mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. During the housewarming party, Rebecca gave guests a tour, proudly announcing that she had designed everything herself. I stood silently in the corner, knowing that many of the design elements had come from conversations with me, ideas I had shared when Rebecca had asked for my input months earlier. Diana noticed my discomfort and squeezed my hand. "Mom, are you okay?" she whispered. I nodded and smiled, unwilling to create a scene at my son's important event. But later that night, I cried in Richard's arms, mourning the close relationship I once had with our firstborn. Richard found himself caught in an impossible position. He loved his son and was proud of his business acumen, but he saw how Brandon's attitude toward me had changed. When Richard would try to intervene, Brandon would smooth things over temporarily, only for the pattern to resume days later. Richard, always conflict-averse in family matters, eventually stopped trying to mediate. "He's under a lot of pressure at work, Margaret," Richard would say. "Give him time to adjust to his new responsibilities." But time only seemed to make things worse, not better. The first time I was explicitly excluded from a business discussion was during a family dinner at our home. After dessert, Richard mentioned a potential new project, and Brandon immediately suggested they discuss it in Richard's office. When I rose to join them, Brandon said, "This is just business stuff, Mom. You'd be bored." Richard hesitated but ultimately followed Brandon without insisting I join them. That night marked a turning point. As I washed dishes alone in the kitchen, I realized that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I was being systematically removed from decisions and discussions that had once included me. My opinions, once valued by Richard, were now considered irrelevant by my son, and Richard lacked the energy or will to fight against this new status quo. Sophia noticed the change during her monthly family visits. "Mom, what's going on between you and Brandon?" she asked during one of our private conversations. "He treats you like you're invisible." I downplayed my concerns, not wanting to create division between the siblings. "He's just busy with the business," I said. "It's a stressful time for everyone." But Sophia, with her doctor's perceptiveness, wasn't fooled. "It's more than that," she insisted. "And Dad seems to be letting it happen. That's not like him." She was right, of course. Richard had always been my champion, my partner in all things. But as his health declined, so did his willingness to confront Brandon about his behavior. Whether from fatigue or fear of creating irreparable family damage, Richard retreated from these conflicts, leaving me increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by family. 6 months ago, Richard suffered a massive heart attack while at the office. Brandon called me from the hospital, his voice uncharacteristically shaken. "Dad collapsed during a meeting," he said. "The doctors say it's serious. You need to come now." I rushed to the hospital, my hands trembling so badly I could barely drive. When I arrived, I found Brandon and Rebecca already there, Brandon pacing the waiting room while Rebecca sat scrolling through her phone. Diana arrived minutes after me, tears streaming down her face. Sophia, who worked at the same hospital, met us in her scrubs, having heard about Richard's condition from colleagues. For 3 terrifying days, Richard remained in the cardiac intensive care unit. The doctors spoke of damaged heart muscles, of narrowed arteries and reduced function. I stayed by his side, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair, holding his hand and praying for his recovery. Brandon visited during business hours, always bringing paperwork with him, dividing his attention between his father and Reynolds Construction. When Richard finally opened his eyes and recognized me, the relief was overwhelming. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice weak. "I had the strangest dream." His recovery was slow but steady. The cardiologist was clear. Richard needed to make significant lifestyle changes. Less stress, more rest, a different diet, and most importantly, a shift in priorities. During his 2-week hospital stay, Richard had time to reflect on his life and legacy. One evening, when we were alone in his hospital room, he took my hand and looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "I've been a fool, Margaret," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on building something for Brandon to inherit that I've allowed him to disrespect the woman who made it all possible." I tried to dismiss his concerns, attributing them to medication and the emotional aftermath of his near-death experience. But Richard was insistent. "No, I've seen it happening and said nothing. That stops now." He squeezed my hand. "When I get out of here, we need to talk about the future. About what happens to everything we've built together." Once Richard returned home, he spent more time observing the family dynamics with fresh eyes. During a Sunday dinner, when Brandon casually dismissed one of my suggestions about a family vacation, I saw Richard's expression harden. Later that night he mentioned it. "I never realized how dismissive Brandon has become," he said as we prepared for bed. "Not just with you but with Diana too. It's like he only values people who contribute to the business." Richard's realization led to several private conversations between us about our legacy. Reynolds Construction had grown beyond our wildest dreams, but at what cost? If the company's success had contributed to our son becoming someone who disrespected his mother and looked down on his artistic sister, was that truly success? "I want to make some changes to my will," Richard told me one morning over breakfast. "The current arrangement leaves the business majority to Brandon, with smaller shares for the girls and provisions for you. But I'm not sure that's the right approach anymore." The next day, Richard contacted Gerald Franklin, our attorney of 20 years. Gerald came to our home, and the 3 of us sat in Richard's study discussing options. I was surprised by how detailed Richard's new vision was. He had clearly been thinking about this for some time. "I want to ensure Margaret is protected," Richard explained to Gerald. "Not just financially but in terms of respect and position. She helped build Reynolds Construction as much as I did, and that needs to be recognized formally." Gerald took copious notes as Richard outlined his wishes. The business would still be divided among the children, but with a more equitable distribution. Brandon would receive 40%, while Sophia and Diana would each receive 20%. The remaining 20%, a controlling share when combined with either of the girls, would go to me. This ensures that no major decisions can be made without either Margaret's approval or the agreement of all three siblings, Richard explained. It forces communication and consensus. Additionally, Richard established a family foundation to be funded by a percentage of the company's annual profits. The foundation would support arts education, combining Diana's passion for art with Sophia's commitment to children's welfare. I would serve as the foundation's chairperson. Brandon won't like this, Gerald warned. He's been operating under the assumption that he'll have controlling interest in the company. Richard nodded grimly. I know, but this isn't just about what Brandon wants. It's about what's right for the whole family. As Gerald finalized the paperwork, I felt conflicted. While I appreciated Richard's desire to protect me and create a more balanced legacy, I worried about the fallout. Brandon had been promised leadership of Reynolds Construction since he was a young man. How would he react to this significant change in plans? Are you sure about this? I asked Richard after Gerald left. Brandon will see this as a betrayal. Richard took my hands in his. If protecting your dignity and ensuring you're respected is seen as a betrayal by our son, then we've already lost him, Margaret. This isn't just about money or power. It's about values. The values we try to instill in our children. When Richard signed the updated will a week later, there was a solemnity to the moment. We both understood that this document might either heal our family or fracture it beyond repair. But Richard was resolute. Promise me something, Margaret, he said that night. Promise me you'll stand your ground, no matter how difficult things get. Don't let Brandon bully you into giving up what's rightfully yours. I promised, never imagining how soon that promise would be tested. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 73 days after his heart attack, Richard kissed me goodbye as he left for a doctor's appointment. I'll pick up those books you wanted from the library on my way home, he said, lingering at the door longer than usual. In retrospect, I wonder if some part of him knew we wouldn't see each other again. The call came 3 hours later. Richard had suffered another, more catastrophic heart attack while driving home from his appointment. He managed to pull over before losing consciousness, but by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. My Richard was gone. The world became a blur of faces and voices offering condolences that couldn't penetrate the fog of my grief. Brandon arrived at the hospital first, immediately taking charge of arrangements and paperwork. He placed a brief hand on my shoulder before turning to the doctor to discuss details, leaving me sitting alone in the sterile waiting room. Sophia arrived next, still in her medical coat, her face streaked with tears. Unlike her brother, she sat beside me and held me as we both cried. Diana came last, collapsing into my arms with heaving sobs that matched the anguish in my own heart. What do we do now, Mom? Diana whispered, sounding like a lost child rather than a woman in her 30s. How do we live without Dad? I had no answer. After 40 years of partnership, I couldn't imagine a world without Richard in it. But as the mother, even in my grief, I had to be strong for my children. Or so I thought. Brandon quickly demonstrated that he didn't need my strength or guidance. Within hours of Richard's death, he was making calls to the funeral home, the church, and Reynolds Construction executives. When I suggested we wait until morning to make these arrangements, giving us all time to process our loss, Brandon dismissed my concern. The business can't wait, Mom. Dad would want us to handle this efficiently. His voice was steady, unemotional. Rebecca stood beside him, her hand protectively on his arm, her expression a practiced mask of appropriate sorrow. The days that followed established a pattern. Brandon took control of the funeral arrangements, consulting me only as a formality. When I mentioned Richard's preference for a simple, intimate service, Brandon overruled me. Dad was a prominent businessman, he argued. The funeral needs to reflect his standing in the community. We'll have a large service at the cathedral, with a reception at the Grand Hotel afterward. I was too exhausted by grief to fight. I let Brandon arrange the elaborate funeral, watching from the sidelines as my husband's passing became a networking event for business associates who barely knew the man I loved. Sophia noticed my withdrawal and tried to intervene. "Brandon, Mom should have more input in these decisions," she said during a family meeting at my house. "This is her husband we're talking about." Brandon barely looked up from his notepad. "I'm handling it, Sophia. Mom's upset right now. She doesn't need the stress of planning a funeral." The way he spoke about me, as if I weren't sitting right there at the table, was becoming a familiar pattern. In Brandon's mind, I had been reduced from matriarch to someone to be managed, an afterthought in the important business of honoring Richard's memory. Diana was struggling in her own way, always the most emotionally expressive of my children. She couldn't contain her grief. She stayed at my house in the days following Richard's death, sleeping in her childhood bedroom and often waking with nightmares. During the day, she would follow me around the house, helping with chores or just sitting nearby, as if afraid to let me out of her sight. "I don't know how to do this, Mom," she confessed one evening as we sorted through old family photos. "I don't know how to say goodbye to Dad." I held my youngest daughter close, my own tears mingling with hers. "We don't say goodbye, sweetheart. We carry him with us in our hearts. That's how love works. It doesn't end with death." Diana found comfort in these conversations, but Brandon seemed annoyed by what he termed her excessive emotionality. At the funeral home, when Diana broke down sobbing while viewing Richard's body, Brandon pulled her aside. "You need to pull yourself together," I overheard him saying. "People are watching. This isn't just about your feelings." I wanted to intervene to tell my son that grief isn't something to be controlled or hidden away, but I was dealing with my own overwhelming emotions. Besides, the growing distance between Brandon and me made me hesitant to challenge him directly. The funeral itself was exactly as Brandon had planned: grand, formal, and impersonal. Hundreds of people attended, many of whom I barely recognized. Business associates gave polished speeches about Richard's professional achievements, while personal stories and memories were kept to a minimum. I sat in the front row, flanked by Sophia and Diana, while Brandon sat slightly apart with Rebecca. During the service, I noticed him checking his phone several times, his mind already moving on to business matters. It struck me then that Brandon was handling his father's death the same way he handled everything else, as a business transaction to be completed efficiently before moving on to the next task. After the funeral, as guests mingled at the reception, I overheard a conversation between Brandon and Howard Jenkins, Richard's longtime business partner. "We should meet next week to discuss the transition," Brandon was saying. "I have some ideas about restructuring that I think will streamline operations." Howard glanced at me standing nearby and lowered his voice. "Shouldn't we wait until after the will reading?" "Out of respect for your mother." Brandon's response chilled me. "The will is a formality. Dad and I discussed the succession plan years ago. Mom will be taken care of, but the business decisions need to move forward now." It was clear that Brandon had no idea about Richard's recent changes to his will. He was operating under the assumption that everything would proceed according to the original plan, with him taking full control of Reynolds Construction. The realization that a significant confrontation was looming filled me with dread, but also a strange sense of resolve. Richard had made his wishes clear, and I had promised to honor them. As the funeral reception wound down, Brandon approached me with a folder in his hand. "Mom, Gerald Franklin called about setting up the will reading. I told him we'll do it at my house next Friday. That gives everyone time to get back to their normal routines first." The fact that he had made this decision without consulting me was yet another example of how Brandon had positioned himself as the family authority. But his next words were even more revealing. "Don't worry about understanding all the business details," he said, patting my arm condescendingly. "I'll make sure everything is explained simply, and you'll be well taken care of." In that moment, looking into my son's eyes, I realized that he truly believed I was incapable of understanding the business Richard and I had built together. In Brandon's mind, I was just Richard's wife, not his partner. Not the woman who had sacrificed her own career, who had hosted countless business dinners, who had offered advice on difficult decisions late into the night. "Thank you, Brandon," I said quietly, choosing not to confront him yet. "I appreciate your concern." That night, Alone in the bed I had shared with Richard for 4 decades, I made a decision. I would not allow Brandon to erase me from our family's legacy. I would honor Richard's final wishes, even if it meant confronting the son who no longer seemed to see me as an equal member of the family. The stage was set for a reckoning none of us were truly prepared for. 3 days after the funeral, Gerald Franklin called me directly. "Margaret, I wanted to check in on you," he said, his voice gentle with concern. "How are you holding up?" I appreciated his kindness but knew this wasn't just a courtesy call. "Brandon mentioned you contacted him about the will reading," I said. "He's arranged for it to be at his house next Friday." There was a pause on the line. "Yes, he was quite insistent about that," Gerald replied carefully. "I usually conduct these meetings at my office, but he said you would be more comfortable in a family setting." The implication that Brandon was making decisions based on my comfort was almost laughable given his recent behavior. "What do you think about this arrangement, Gerald?" I asked. "Professionally speaking, I prefer neutral territory for these matters," he admitted. "But if the family is in agreement, I can accommodate the request." I considered insisting on moving the meeting back to Gerald's office but decided against it. If Brandon wanted home court advantage for what he thought would be his moment of triumph, let him have it. The outcome would be the same regardless of location. "That's fine, Gerald," I said. "Brandon's house will work." Gerald cleared his throat. "Margaret, I think it would be wise for you to have a copy of the updated will before the meeting. Would you like me to send it over by courier today?" "Yes, please," I replied, grateful for his foresight. "I'd like to review it again." The document arrived that afternoon in a sealed envelope. I sat at Richard's desk in his study and carefully read through each provision, making sure I understood every detail. The language was complex, but the intent was clear. Richard had created a structure that would require cooperation among all family members, with me holding a crucial decision-making position. I tucked the document into my personal files, deciding to keep this knowledge to myself for now. Brandon clearly believed he knew what the will contained, and his confidence suggested he hadn't been informed of the changes. Richard must have decided to let the will reading itself serve as the revelation. As the days passed, Brandon's behavior toward me grew increasingly dismissive. He called daily, but his conversations focused on practical matters. Had I contacted the insurance company? When was I planning to clear out Richard's closet? Did I need help downsizing to a smaller place? Downsizing, I repeated during one such call. "Brandon, I have no intention of leaving the home your father and I built together." "Mom, be practical," he said with exaggerated patience. "That house is far too large for one person. Besides, the property taxes alone will eat into your fixed income. I'm just looking out for your financial security." He spoke as if I had no understanding of our family finances, as if Richard and I hadn't managed our money together for decades. I wanted to remind him that I had been balancing the household budget since before he was born, but I held my tongue. Friday's meeting would clarify many things. The day before the will reading, Sophia called. "Mom, something feels off about tomorrow," she said. "Brandon's been making strange comments about ensuring the company's future and honoring Dad's legacy." "Did Dad tell you anything about his plans for the business?" I chose my words carefully. "Your father and I discussed many things during his final months, Sophia. But I think it's best if we all hear Gerald's official reading tomorrow rather than speculating now." "I'm worried about how Brandon will react if things don't go exactly as he expects," Sophia confessed. "He seems so certain about what the will contains." Her concern was valid. Brandon had never responded well to disappointment, even as a child. When things didn't go his way, his first reaction was always anger, followed by attempts to change the outcome through sheer force of will. As an adult, these tendencies had only intensified. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Sophia, we need to remember that your father wanted what was best for the entire family, not just one member of it," I said. Diana visited that evening, bringing dinner and staying to help me choose an outfit for the next day. Unlike Sophia, she seemed oblivious to the tension brewing, focused instead on her own grief and anxiety. "Do you think Dad would be happy with how we've handled everything?" she asked as we sat in the kitchen. The funeral seemed so formal, not really like him at all. Your father understood that different people grieve in different ways, I said diplomatically. Brandon needed the structure of a formal service. Diana pushed her food around her plate. Brandon acts like Dad's death is a business transaction, like we need to efficiently process it and move on. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That's his way of coping, sweetheart. We all handle loss differently. But as I lay awake that night, I wondered if Diana was right. Had Brandon reduced Richard's death, and indeed Richard's life, to a series of assets to be distributed and problems to be solved? Had he forgotten the values that had guided Richard's business decisions, the emphasis on family and integrity above mere profit? Morning arrived with a sense of foreboding. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that Richard had always admired, applied minimal makeup to hide the signs of sleepless nights, and packed the copy of the will in my purse. As I was about to leave, I paused in front of Richard's photograph on our bedroom dresser. Give me strength today, I whispered to his smiling image. Help me honor your wishes without destroying our family in the process. The drive to Brandon and Rebecca's mansion felt interminable. Their home was an ostentatious display of wealth, with manicured grounds and a circular driveway large enough to accommodate a dozen cars. Today, only Gerald's sedan and Sophia's practical SUV were parked outside. As I rang the doorbell, I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. Whatever happened in the next few hours would change our family forever. I needed to face it with the same dignity and resolve that Richard had shown throughout his life. Rebecca answered the door wearing an impeccably tailored black dress that seemed more appropriate for a business meeting than a family gathering. Margaret. She greeted me with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. Brandon's in his office with Mr. Franklin. Sophia and Diana are in the living room. I followed her through the marble-floored entryway into their formal living room, a space designed to impress rather than comfort. The furniture was modern and angular, the color palette restricted to blacks, whites, and grays. It looked like a showroom rather than a home. Sophia rose immediately to embrace me. Mom, how are you holding up? She asked, genuine concern in her eyes. Diana, who had been staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, turned and rushed to join our hug. I barely slept last night, she admitted. This all feels so final. For a few moments I held my daughters close, drawing strength from their presence. These two at least still treated me as their mother, not as an inconvenient loose end to be managed. Rebecca stood apart, checking her watch. Brandon should be ready for us soon, she said. He wanted to discuss some details with Mr. Franklin privately first. The implication that Brandon deserved a private consultation while the rest of us waited was clear, but I chose not to comment. Instead, I sat between my daughters on the uncomfortable sofa, making small talk about Sophia's children and Diana's latest art project. After 20 minutes, Brandon appeared in the doorway. He had dressed formally in a dark suit and tie, as if for an important business meeting. We're ready now, he announced. Everyone please come to my office. We followed him down a hallway lined with expensive artwork to a large home office that mimicked Richard's workplace with eerie precision. The same style of mahogany desk, the same arrangement of chairs, even similar family photographs on the credenza behind it. It was as if Brandon was trying to recreate his father's authority by duplicating his surroundings. Gerald Franklin stood as we entered, nodding respectfully to each of us. Thank you all for coming today, he said. I know this is a difficult time for the family. Brandon gestured to the chairs arranged in front of the desk. Please everyone have a seat. He moved behind the desk, symbolically placing himself in the position of authority. I noticed Gerald's slight frown at this arrangement, but he said nothing, instead opening his briefcase and removing a folder containing Richard's will. Before Gerald could begin, Brandon cleared his throat. Before we start, I think we should keep this meeting focused on the essential business matters, he said. Mom, I know this might be overwhelming for you, with all the legal terminology and business details. Maybe it would be better if you waited in the living room, and we can explain everything to you afterward in simpler terms. The room fell silent. Sophia's mouth dropped open in shock. Diana looked from Brandon to me, confusion evident on her face. Gerald Franklin froze, the will half removed from its folder. Excuse me, I said, certain I must have misheard. Brandon's expression was a mixture of condescension and impatience. This is family business, Mom. Reynolds Construction stuff that Dad, the girls, and I need to sort out. We'll let you know the relevant parts afterward. Rebecca nodded in agreement. Margaret, I've asked Marta to prepare tea in the living room. You'll be much more comfortable there. I felt as if I'd been slapped. After 40 years of marriage, after helping build Reynolds Construction from nothing, after raising these children and supporting their father through every challenge, I was being dismissed as if I were an outsider. This is family, Mom, Brandon continued, gesturing toward the door. We'll let you know later. Those words, this is family, echoed in my mind, twisting like a knife. In Brandon's eyes, I was no longer family now that Richard was gone. I was an inconvenience, a complication to be managed. I saw Sophia start to protest, her face flushed with anger. Diana looked close to tears. But before either could speak, I raised my hand to stop them. With deliberate calm, I opened my purse and removed the copy of Richard's updated will that Gerald had sent me. Actually, Brandon, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me, I think I'll stay. Brandon frowned, glancing at the document in my hand. What's that? It's a copy of your father's will, I replied. The updated version he signed 3 months ago, after his heart attack. Brandon's confident expression faltered slightly. Updated version? Dad didn't mention any updates to me. Gerald Franklin cleared his throat. Mr. Reynolds made significant changes to his will following his hospitalization, he confirmed. He was quite specific about his new wishes. Brandon's face darkened. What kind of changes? Rather than answering directly, I turned to Gerald. Perhaps you should proceed with the official reading, Gerald. I believe that will clarify everything. Gerald nodded and began to read the will aloud. As the provisions were revealed, the equal division of family assets, the restructured ownership of Reynolds Construction with me holding a critical 20% share, the establishment of the family foundation under my chairmanship, I watched the color drain from Brandon's face. This can't be right, he interrupted halfway through. Dad promised me controlling interest in the company. We discussed it for years. This must be a mistake. It's not a mistake, Brandon, I said quietly. Your father revised his will very deliberately. He wanted to ensure that Reynolds Construction remained a family company in the truest sense, one where all family members have a voice. Brandon stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He wasn't thinking clearly after his heart attack. He was on medication. This will can be contested. Gerald Franklin shook his head. Mr. Reynolds was of sound mind when he made these changes. He underwent a psychological evaluation specifically to prevent such challenges. The will is legally binding and quite solid. The reality of the situation was slowly dawning on Brandon. His carefully laid plans for taking complete control of Reynolds Construction were dissolving before his eyes. The power he had assumed was already his was now being redistributed among all of us. Why would he do this? Brandon demanded, looking directly at me with accusation in his eyes. Did you pressure him when he was vulnerable? The suggestion was so offensive that I nearly lost my composure, but I forced myself to remain calm. Your father made these decisions himself, Brandon. He saw how the family dynamics were changing. He was concerned about the direction you were taking the company. And yes, he was troubled by how you've been treating me since he became ill. This is ridiculous, Brandon scoffed. I've been running that company for years while Dad was semi-retired. I've increased profits by 30%. I've modernized operations. And now I'm supposed to check with my artist sister and my retired mother before making business decisions. Diana flinched at his dismissive tone. Sophia reached over and took my hand, squeezing it supportively. Your father built Reynolds Construction on relationships, not just profits, I reminded him. He valued the long-time employees you've been pushing out. He cared about the community projects you've been cutting from the budget. He believed in building something that would last, not just something that would make the most money in the short term. Brandon paced behind the desk, his face flushed with anger. I'll contest this, he threatened. I have emails, conversations with Dad about succession planning. This new will contradicts everything he told me for years. People change, Brandon, Sophia said quietly. Dad had a near-death experience. It made him reevaluate what was important. And apparently I wasn't important. Brandon snapped. After everything I've done for the company, this is how he repays me? The self-centered nature of his response was revealing. In Brandon's mind, the company existed to serve him, not the other way around. It was a stark contrast to Richard's view that Reynolds Construction was a vehicle to provide for the family and serve the community. Your father loved you very much, I said, keeping my voice gentle despite the tension in the room. This isn't about punishing you. It's about protecting the legacy he built and ensuring that all members of this family are respected and included. Brandon's laugh was bitter. Respected and included? Is that why you brought a copy of the will to ambush me at what you knew would be a difficult meeting? I brought it because I suspected you might try to exclude me. I replied honestly. And I was right. You asked me to leave the room, Brandon. You said, "This is family," as if I'm not part of this family anymore now that your father is gone. My words hung in the air, their truth undeniable. Even Rebecca had the grace to look uncomfortable. Gerald Franklin closed his folder. Perhaps we should take some time to process this information. The legal requirements have been fulfilled with this reading, but clearly there are family matters that need to be discussed. Brandon shook his head. There's nothing to discuss. This will is going to be challenged. I've invested too much in Reynolds Construction to have my authority undermined like this. It was at that moment that I truly understood the depth of the problem. Brandon saw the company as his personal achievement, his property. He had forgotten that it began as a family dream, built on Richard's vision and my support, meant to benefit all of us. Brandon, I said, standing to face my son directly, this confrontational approach isn't what your father would have wanted. He revised his will hoping it would bring this family closer together, not drive us further apart. Can we at least try to honor that intention? For a brief moment I thought I saw a flicker of the son I remembered, the boy who had adored his father and wanted to make him proud. But it vanished quickly, replaced by the hard-edged businessman Brandon had become. I'll have my lawyers contact you, Mr. Franklin, Brandon said, effectively dismissing us all. This meeting is over. As we prepared to leave, Diana approached her brother. Brandon, please don't do this, she pleaded. We're all grieving Dad. Let's not fight over his legacy. Brandon barely looked at her. This isn't about grief, Diana. It's about business. Something you've never understood. Diana recoiled as if she'd been slapped, and Sophia quickly put an arm around her shoulders. Come on, she murmured. Let's go. As we walked toward the door, I turned back one last time. Brandon stood behind Richard's replica desk, his posture rigid, his expression closed. In that moment he looked so much like his father physically, yet so different in spirit. I loved your father for 40 years, I said softly. Everything I did, everything I sacrificed, was for this family, including you, Brandon. I hope someday you'll understand that. He didn't respond, and I didn't expect him to. The battle lines had been drawn, and it was clear that the inheritance meeting was just the beginning of a longer, more painful conflict. As I left my son's house that day, I carried with me not just the legal document that protected my rights, but also the heavy knowledge that honoring Richard's final wishes might cost me my relationship with our firstborn child. The weeks following the will reading were tense and difficult. True to his word, Brandon hired an expensive attorney to contest the will, claiming that Richard had been unduly influenced during his illness. The legal challenge created a formal divide in our family, with Brandon on one side and Sophia, Diana, and me on the other. I found myself in the position of having to defend not only my own interests but also Richard's final wishes. It was a painful irony. The man who had protected me throughout our marriage now needed me to protect his legacy after his death. The first board meeting of Reynolds Construction under the new ownership structure was a tense affair. Brandon arrived with his attorney and a folder full of proposals that would have effectively sidelined me and consolidated his power despite the ownership percentages. I was prepared, however, having spent days reviewing company documents and consulting with Gerald Franklin about my rights and responsibilities. Before we discuss any new business, I said when Brandon tried to rush through the agenda, I'd like to review the company's current projects and financial position. As a 20% shareholder and board member, I'm entitled to complete information. Brandon's jaw tightened, but with the company's CFO and other executives present, he couldn't refuse. For the next 2 hours, I asked detailed questions about decisions he had made over the past year. The layoffs of long-time employees, the canceled community projects, the aggressive cost-cutting measures that had boosted short-term profits but potentially damaged long-term relationships. My mother is concerned about the human elements of business, Brandon explained to the room dismissively. But Reynolds Construction needs to remain competitive in a challenging market. Reynolds Construction needs to remain true to the principles that built it, I countered. Your father believed that treating employees well and investing in the community weren't just nice ideas. They were good business practices that created loyalty and goodwill. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to everyone present that I was not the decorative figurehead Brandon had expected me to be. I knew the business, understood the financials, and intended to be an active participant in decision-making. As we were leaving, Howard Jenkins, Richard's old friend and a longtime executive, approached me. "Margaret, Richard would be proud of you today," he said quietly. "He always said you were the backbone of everything he built." His words gave me strength for the difficult days ahead. Brandon's legal challenge dragged on, requiring depositions and document reviews that forced us to relive painful family moments. Diana struggled with the conflict, often calling me in tears after interactions with her brother. "He acts like I'm betraying Dad by supporting you," she told me during one late-night call. "But I'm just trying to honor what Dad actually wanted, not what Brandon thinks he wanted." Sophia, with her measured approach to conflict, tried to mediate. She arranged a family dinner, neutral territory at a restaurant Richard had loved, hoping to find common ground. Brandon and Rebecca arrived late, and the conversation remained stilted and formal throughout the meal. "We're still family," Sophia reminded us as dessert was served. "Dad would hate seeing us divided like this." Brandon set down his fork. "Dad made his choices," he said flatly. "He chose to change everything we had planned without even discussing it with me. That was his right. And it's my right to challenge what I believe was a mistake made when he wasn't thinking clearly." "He was thinking more clearly than ever," I said. "Near-death experiences have a way of bringing important things into focus." Brandon's legal challenge ultimately failed. The psychological evaluation Richard had undergone specifically to prevent such challenges proved decisive. The judge ruled that the will was valid and legally binding, and Brandon was ordered to pay legal costs. I expected the ruling to deepen the rift between us, but something unexpected happened instead. The day after the judge's decision, Brandon appeared at my door, alone and without his usual confident demeanor. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice subdued. I led him to the living room, the same room where he and Richard had spent countless hours discussing business over the years. For a long moment, Brandon said nothing, just looked around at the familiar surroundings. "I found some of Dad's old journals in his office desk," he finally said. "Business journals he kept when he was first starting out." I nodded. Richard had always been meticulous about documentation, recording not just figures and contracts but also his thoughts and plans. "There are entries about you in almost every page," Brandon continued. "How you helped him think through problems, how you kept the household running when money was tight, how you entertained clients who eventually became our biggest accounts." He paused. "He called you his secret weapon." The reference brought tears to my eyes. It was Richard's private nickname for me, one I hadn't heard in years. "I didn't know," Brandon admitted. "Or maybe I did once and I forgot. I started seeing the business as something Dad built, not something you built together." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. A small crack in the wall that had formed between us. "Your father was a wonderful businessman," I said carefully, "but he never saw Reynolds Construction as just a business. It was a vehicle for creating security for his family and contributing to the community. The money was important, but it wasn't the only measure of success." Brandon nodded slowly. The journals made that clear. His definition of success was different from mine. "Not better or worse," I clarified. "Just different. There's room for both perspectives, Brandon." That's why he structured the will the way he did, to balance the focus on profits with attention to the human elements of business. Our conversation that day didn't resolve all our differences, but it opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. Over the following months, a tentative new relationship began to form. Brandon remained focused on the business aspects of Reynolds Construction, but he became more willing to listen to alternative viewpoints. I found myself appreciating his financial acumen even while challenging some of his approaches. Sophia observed the change with relief. "You two are more alike than either of you realize," she told me after a relatively peaceful board meeting. "You're both stubborn and principled. Dad used to say that's why you butted heads so often." The idea made me smile. Perhaps Richard had understood our dynamic better than we did ourselves. Diana found her place in the new family structure through the foundation Richard had established. As an artist herself, she had valuable insights into how best to support arts education in our community. The work gave her a connection to her father's legacy that fit her unique talents and interests. A year after Richard's death, Reynolds Construction was thriving under our shared leadership. Brandon's business instincts, tempered by my insistence on maintaining Richard's values, had created a company that was both profitable and principled. We weren't always in agreement, but we had learned to listen to each other with at least some measure of respect. On the anniversary of Richard's passing, I visited his grave alone. The granite headstone was simple and elegant, just as he would have wanted. "We're doing okay, Richard," I said softly. "Not perfect, but okay. The family is healing slowly but surely." As I placed flowers beside the headstone, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The pain of being told, "This is family, Mom. We'll let you know later," had been profound, but it had also been a necessary catalyst for change. Without that moment of exclusion, without the hurt it caused, we might never have confronted the underlying issues that had been dividing our family for years. Standing up for myself and for Richard's wishes had been the hardest thing I'd ever done. It would have been easier to retreat, to accept Brandon's vision of my role as a passive beneficiary, rather than an active participant in our family's legacy. But that would have betrayed everything Richard and I had built together. True inheritance isn't just about money or property or even business shares. It's about values and principles, about the example we set for those who come after us. Richard understood that, and in his final act of revising his will, he gave me the opportunity to demonstrate those values to our children and grandchildren. As I drove home from the cemetery, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for too long. Our family wasn't perfect and probably never would be. Brandon and I would likely always have different perspectives on many issues, but we were finding a way forward together, honoring Richard's memory not by clinging to what had been, but by creating something new that incorporated the best of his vision while adapting to changing circumstances. That, I believe, is the truest form of legacy, not preserved in amber, unchanging and rigid, but living and evolving while remaining rooted in fundamental values of respect, fairness, and family unity. If you've ever had to stand up for yourself against family members who tried to sideline you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. How did you find the courage to assert your rightful place? What happened afterward? Remember to like this video if my story resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life experiences, and share with someone who might need encouragement to stand their ground in difficult family situations. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting, especially when they're fought with love rather than bitterness.